Hello and welcome to our podcast. We're going to be talking today about Jesus and whether or not he led a nonviolent tax rebellion against Rome. We'll be referencing a number of Bible verses. What you're looking at here are all of the Bible verses in the Synoptics that pertain to either tax collector or taxes. And I've color-coded them into groups to make it a little bit easier to wrap your minds around. First of all, in the upper right in red, the three synoptics, each of the three synoptics records the call of Levi or Matthew, who was a tax collector. To the right of that, in orange, mainly all coming from Matthew, we see that Jesus is associated with tax collectors and Gentiles or tax collectors and prostitutes. Over on the left again in blue, these are somewhat interesting. They're in both Matthew, Mark, and Luke, where it documents that he eats with tax collectors and even attended a banquet. Over on the right, in green, Matthew mentions that Jesus was a friend of tax collectors and sinners in both Matthew and Luke. Right below that, in pink from Luke, it mentions that tax collectors were baptized. Down from that, in blue, from Matthew and Luke, it talks tax collectors are mentioned in the Sermon on the Mount, and there's the story of Zacchaeus, who's a tax collector. Over on the right again in black, there are two parables in which tax collectors are in the parable of the lost sheep, and the other three, all of these are from Luke, the other three are in the same parable of the tax collector and praying. At the bottom is what we're going to be concentrating on today. You'll see that from Matthew, we have both the story of paying the temple tax and finding the temple tax in a fish's mouth, as well as the rendering unto Caesar what is Caesar's that appears in both Matthew and Luke, and we'll be concentrating on the Lucan account of that. Lastly, that we won't really be considering in today, is Paul mentions taxes in Romans, only to say that Paul was a Roman citizen, and he said you should probably pay your taxes. So that's a brief synopsis of all of the scriptural references that we could find that mentions Jesus and in taxes or tax collectors. So at this point, I'm going to turn it over to Don.
But I wonder, when I want to say in advance, I wonder if anybody has addressed this question. Why is it that Jesus is hanging out an inordinate amount of time with tax collectors? Why do tax collectors come up so often in the story? Now, the pious answer is, of course, Jesus took compassion on all people, even the despised, and the tax collectors were among the despised, along with prostitutes and such, as the kind of, and there's something to that. They are the kind of people you could make it go that way, but it still raises the interesting question. The Gospels are telling us over and over again that Jesus hung out a lot with tax collectors. In Luke, let's put one and one together. Let's just be honest detectives about this. If we already know from Luke that the only thing that one of the three gospel writers, the one who wrote the best Greek, the one who wrote for the Gentiles, the very intelligent Luke, that the only concrete thing that Luke mentioned was, and this is on a state level. By the way, this has to do with a capital crime. It's under the heading of subversion. It's subversion, that's in the first breath, and in the second breath, he opposes taxation. And now we know that he hangs out. Now, ask yourself a question. Would it or would it not be useful, if you're in a tax resistance movement, to have many friends among those who collect taxes? In fact, if I remember correctly, a tax collector was probably a Jew who was a kind of local tax farmer for the Romans and would get a certain percentage, a certain commission for the collection of the taxes. He might indeed be a Jew.
Well, no, the tax collectors were appointed by the Sadducees.
Yeah, so
the Sadducees were responsible. So yes, they would have been Jews.
All right, so we know that they would have been Jews. Now here's Jesus leading a revolutionary movement, And we know that he's charged with only one thing really concretely in Luke, with tax opposition. And we put that together with the fact that publicans, in some translations, now usually it's just tax collectors in our translations, to make it very clear what a publican was.
Well, it is Luke that has Mary and Joseph going to Bethlehem for the census, correct?
You know what? I think you're right about that. It was a tax census, indeed.
Now, there certainly was a census to collect taxes. That was the sole reason for the census.
Correct.
What Luke kind of goes off into Never Never Land is the Romans would have never had people go back to the town of their birth to take their census, because you would have an absolute mess of people on the road. But based on your argument here, I think it's very unique that taxes are on Luke's mind, because he uses it as a mechanism, as if everybody is familiar with this, even mentions the governor's name, Quirinius, and that kind of fits in. Now, when most normal people hear prostitutes and tax collectors, they associate it with something like, well, Jesus hung out with gangbangers and,
Right, exactly.
You're right. There may be something more to this. Because
I submit to you, since I have no dog in the old Christian fight. I'm not a Christian. I'm a Jew, and I'm free of any predisposition. If I were to say to you very simply, examining the text, let me just start more simply. Supposing Luke were my text, and I said, what would you conclude on the basis of this particular text, Luke? I would have to conclude that in Luke's opinion, the chief significant thing, the temple is not mentioned, by the way. He could have mentioned the episode in the temple. He records it, but he doesn't mention it at the time of the trial, curiously. At the time of the trial, when Pilate is told what the charges are specifically that he opposed taxation. That's it. At the very beginning of chapter 23 of Luke, the Sanhedrin has met, and now they want to go upstairs. They are the local Judean court, and they have decided that they want to seek crucifixion, but they can't get crucifixion without the approval of the representative of Rome, Pilate. So we read in chapter 23, verse 1, then the whole assembly rose and led him off to Pilate. And they began to accuse him, saying, quote, we have found this man subverting our nation. He opposes payment of taxes to Caesar and claims to be Christ, a king. And that's it. The Christ King claim is in there.
And the taxes came before Christ.
Before the Messiah claim, even in the list of things, the first thing, they do mention the general claim to be Messiah, but that again is merely, if I say to you, if I walk around the street and say, I confess to you, I am subverting the nation, but you can't find me doing anything wrong, then you can't arrest me, even though I'm a maniac going around saying, I confess to believing in the subversion of the nation. No, the question really is, but what subversive acts have you committed? Because only then can the law intervene and accuse you of some crime.
This gets interesting in even more places, because basically Jesus' ministry was in the Galilee for most of the time. That's where he hung out. Now, Pilate had no jurisdiction over the Galilee, but he did have jurisdiction over Jerusalem.
Correct.
So when Jesus went for Passover to Jerusalem, he surely must have known he was walking into the lion's den, as if he was truly a revolutionary against Rome from the tax point of view.
No,
he would have known that was not a good thing to do.
All right, no, look, sure, let's agree then as we now come up with a much more full-bodied understanding of what went on that week, or however long it was, and I have heard it said that the Gospels are vague enough that you can wonder how long he was actually in Jerusalem ahead of time. We can't make the simple. We're not constrained by anything very important to take the simplistic view that he was only there for a week. The condensation of the Gospels themselves, it's a necessary condensation, leads us to feel that way, but there's no strong historical reason for thinking that way.
No, because the whole idea of a week coincides with the church's idea of the Holy Week.
Mm-hmm.
When we go into the Easter season, it basically starts the Sunday before, and the church literally has this timeline in the liturgy for Jesus was there for a week. He did the cleansing of the temple. He did this. He did that. So that week is pretty much an artificial time frame, most likely that people are familiar with from church teachings.
Yeah, and the theory that, to answer your question of he must have known he was going into the lion's den, was that he was a revolutionary. Yes, he was pacifistic. I still want to say it's very important to understand. But he was a provocateur. It seems to me very, very clear, and that's where I want to get back. Not the tax thing is one form of provocation. It can be a lot of other things too, including a source of funding. Now, I'm not saying that I know that. I don't. But there are many things. But among other things also, it can be a way of encouraging your local tax collector. If you work with him, you know how illicit activities are. If you work with him, you can cut his take. You can protect a lot of poor Jews who might get caught in the taxation net by saying, you can ignore that one. You could ignore that guy, Goldfarb around the block. And they could have been persuasive with him so that they did a lot of good in the Jewish community involving the avoidance of taxation. Taxes were always hated. The Roman taxes were hated.
Well, if there's any one scholar that would have pursued this line of reasoning, it would have been John Dominic. Because he's the one that's very much into, you've got to understand the Romans to understand Jesus. And I've been looking around trying to get more information on Pilate that I think now fits into this even better, in that Pilate was not an aristocrat. He was a minor function. He was not on the road to getting into the Senate. The Romans had this ladder that they climbed that wound up eventually with you being in the Senate.
Yes.
Well, he was not on that road. So but he was apparently a wealthy person, and he gets assigned to rule over the shithole of Judea, basically, is how he would have looked at it. Pilate lived in Caesarea. He had a palace in Caesarea. He only went into Jerusalem when he had to, which was any of the major festivals or anything that there might be the opportunity for insurrection. So Pilate was only going.
Let me interrupt. But he would have his judicial functions. Occasionally, he would have to be he would have to be keeping his office hours at least to dispense with cases that were on his desk. Would he not? I mean,
that would have been beneath him.
But wait, he does, according to Roman law, he does have to deal with capital cases.
That's correct.
Okay.
And he would deal with it in his own time frame. Now, You're right. He may have gone in other times, but he would not have looked forward to going to Jerusalem. I'm thinking in terms of the Sadducees. The Sadducees know they have to make their case to Pilate, and only Pilate can do for them what they want to have done, which is get rid of Jesus. They know Pilate's only going to be in Jerusalem for a set period of time because he's going to head out as soon as Passover's done.
That's good.
So the Sadducees know they've got to make their case and they've got to make it quick, which is why I think the Gospels, you can hear reverberations of it in when Jesus went in and did the temple thing. They decided, okay, we got to do this and we got to do it quick. We can't put it off because Pilate might leave and it might be 6 months before he comes back. So that gives you an idea of the urgency they saw. And I think it's curious, when they go before Pilate in Luke, they mention the two things that would have made Pilate's head rotate around that you've got a problem. He's messing with your taxes, generating insurrection. Those two things were the two main things that Pilate would have gone, I had to do something.
You know, if you start to let your imagination run free as it should about these things, and you say, all right, I'm a movie director, I'm now taking very, very seriously that the disruption that he caused in the temple was a very significant thing. That's on the one hand. And that the tax issue, yeah, something was going on there. Let's just complete the hypothesis. When you already have reason to believe, strong reason to believe from Luke, that the first mentioned and the principal concrete accusation against him has to do with refusal to pay taxes. Among Jesus's group, there were quite a few tax collectors. And then you say, wait a minute. And he stands accused of opposing Roman taxation on a capital level of insurrection. What are you going to conclude? What are you going to conclude about why those tax collectors were in Jesus's presence in the first place?
Was one of his disciples a tax collector?
You know, I think Matthew himself, Matthew, the apostle, not necessarily to be identified with the so-called Matthew,
right,
who's the writer of the first gospel.
Right.
I think Matthew is recalled, the one of the 12, Matthew, the apostle Matthew, is remembered as a tax collector. I believe you're right about that. So I should have brought that up because there's another little fact hiding away in my memory. Yeah, I remember that.
Yeah, I mean, if you're getting together a bunch of spiritual disciples to teach them the spiritual way, a tax collector really wouldn't seem to be one of those people that would be in there.
And this whole spiritualized notion of what Jesus was about. I'm trying to make the point. I'm not trying to say that Jesus was not a man of God and whatnot, who believed in all sorts of amazing things on the spiritual religious plane. We'll get back to that. He certainly was. But on the other hand, he thought that the kingdom of God nonetheless was the actual transformation of this world by means of the overthrow of the political structures of this world on all levels. Locally, the Sanhedrin, he was just as much in rebellion against the law there on that level. That's the overturning of the tables. That's the kind. There are two things now. Think of it, how nicely structured it becomes. He's got one clear attack on whom? Money changers, mentioned in particular. Money. Why is it always on this level of money exchange, taxation, and so forth? That's where he worked, overturning everything there. And that's your crime against the temple. That's the crime that the Judeans would deal with directly. But then they bring to Pilate, they say that's part of that latter part of their accusation, that he claims to be the Messiah. That's the accusation of subversion in that sense. But then they also mention taxation. And that's now specifically said to be taxation concerning Rome, for Caesar. Okay? So now we've got him double-barreled. Crime against Judea, but on the level of subversion of the state. Crime against Rome, also on the level of subversion of the state. And it tells you something else, too, which a historical reconstruction must recognize, it seems to me, is that you don't go to lengths like these to arrange a case like this unless he had been successful to some considerable degree. This is the part of the story unfortunately we don't get through the Gospels.
Well, it gets even better than that, because if you look at, most people aren't even aware that Jesus had a family. Two things are interesting here. Jesus is plugged in to some very politically influential people. Joseph of Arimathea and Nicodemus are both highly political people, very high up in the Jewish government in Jerusalem. Jesus's family is apparently also politically important because his brother James is constantly at odds with the Sadducees. As a matter of fact, the early church fathers say that James was actually the opposition high priest, that he was one of the people that could enter the Holy of Holies. And he was in constant opposition to the Sadducees, to the point that the Sadducees did kill him in 60 AD. He was thrown from the walls of the temple and stoned. So Jesus's whole family is political in all of this and what's going on. Why wouldn't he be?
Yeah, so interestingly, there used to be a theory that Jesus was a zealot. The objection to that is that he was a nonviolent man. The solution to the problem is to recognize that he had adopted a very, very belligerent form of nonviolence. Well, that's it. But it is defiance in your face, and it is political insurrection. It is the danger. Look, how much did the South feel that what they thought was an invasion by the civil rights movement, the sit-ins and whatnot? Alabama, Mississippi summer of 1964, for example, the voting rights movement, where civil rights workers got killed. These people, and in the middle of it was a student nonviolent coordinating committee. Now, at that moment, and it's a very important moment in politics in the nation, black politics internally, because Martin Luther King suddenly was being opposed by people like Stokely Carmichael, who represented a much more typically willing to fight, violence if necessary, wing of the rising Black Power movement. King and others like him, like the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, SNCC, as it was called, still upheld the assertive, disruptive way but it was totally nonviolent. And the question is, could such nonviolence be viewed with anger? And we have from 1964 in the United States of America, in the state of Mississippi, we have clear evidence that they were willing to kill. They felt so threatened by a non-violent movement. It can be done. They could have been exactly such a threat as a non-violent movement, is all I'm saying.
Well, I mean, just look at two modern examples, Gandhi and Martin Luther King.
Exactly. Those
now,
are two examples.
We're familiar with them. I like your phrase, a war of peace, because Martin Luther King was strident and belligerent. So was Gandhi.
That's right.
They just didn't resort to violence.
Yeah, but it was an attempt, in both cases, it was an attempt to change the political structure of things. It wasn't an attempt to bring down the whole state in the case certainly of King, but to affect it very, very deeply, to bring about, which means also, it's an analysis that depends on the following insight, that there is great possible power, real power, which means the ability to change things, real power that is available by nonviolent means. And there really is. The power of that, I want to get the Tiananmen Square case, the famous photograph of the young guy standing in front of the tank, defying the tank to run him over. I'm standing here and he will be crushed if the tank does move forward, but the tank does not. That wonderful moment also, I'd like to get out the photograph, see if we can find it. You remember the photograph of the girl who puts the flower in the rifle?
Yeah.
Now, and the discussion, we could discuss it again, of how important demonstration. I don't know how to process, I'm not sure finally how to process the disruption in the temple that Jesus did, but I do see it as at least partially what we now call a demonstration. It's a very apt concept. You demonstrate something by a certain kind of, it is even a certain kind of theater in a noble sense, a good kind of street theater that brings attention to something And when it brings attention, just as when we march down Fifth Avenue, that's another kind of demonstration, just a parade against the war in Vietnam. That's a very simple form of demonstrating something. When you sit in, it's called a sit-in demonstration. There, you're actually breaking the rules. You're sitting down in a chair. You're a black person sitting in a chair that says whites only. But you're not. So you are breaking the law. Yes, we have to discuss all that. But you are not being violent. You're sitting in a chair. This is the concept of aggressive, in your face, defiant, breaking the law when necessary, but still and all nonviolent power. Real power
doesn't mean that you can't be aggressively pursuing means that will make their life so miserable they'll pick up and leave.
So who's the they here? Say it again.
Gandhi. How did Gandhi make the English leave India?
Yes. Oh, yes.
He won, but he didn't do it by simply kissing them on the cheek. He made the British life miserable. You want to occupy this country, you will have to be willing to hang out and spend a lot of money doing it.
Well, that's excellent because, a large part of the sentiment in Judea, which did still have living memories of a time of independence that it had for about 100 years under the Hasmoneans, the Maccabees, not all that long ago. It was within their recent memory. Their fervent desire would be for the Romans to pull out, simply to pull out and restore to them their full autonomy. The way the Romans saw it, will give them partial autonomy. They gave them quite a bit of local autonomy. That's the way the Romans worked. It was very smart of them to work that way, but they didn't give them absolute or final autonomy, which is critical to our story. Jesus does this all the time. That joke he makes, we talked about it last time, where he tells Peter to go fishing, and you'll find a 4 drachma coin in the fish's mouth, the first fish you catch. The man has a sense of humor. I
think about this.
I bet you there are Christians out there, a majority of them, they call themselves fundamentalists, who actually believe that a miracle like that happened, that Peter actually went fishing and caught a fish with a 4 drachma coin in its mouth.
Not to mention Peter's job was a fisherman.
Yeah.
So everybody would have gotten the joke. So, hey, go on down, fish in the river. It all ties together.
And here, in his cunning, we have to note one aspect of his cunning. He was brilliant in dialogue. He was brilliant in confounding his listeners and beating them in verbal interaction. Big. The Jews, I might say, we Jews tend to be good at that to this very day. We're good with words. We know how to win arguments. We know how to win arguments even when we don't win them. When we evade them, which can be just as important, when we slip free from the trap that a certain form of interrogation may involve. And that's what's going on here, because now item unmentioned as yet, item 3, big item 3 on the taxation front. Why in the world are they? The gospel tells us clearly they tried to trap him by asking him the following question. It just so happens that in Luke, I come across chapter 19. It's got a big title given by the editor, Zacchaeus the tax collector. So now, we're in Luke. I'm going to actually start at Luke. This is easy to remember. Luke 20:20. And it's got my editor gives me the title to this section of the text, Paying Taxes to Caesar. Okay? Keeping a close watch on him, and it's not clear, from the preceding paragraph, it's implied that the chief priests and the teachers of the law would be the ones who were keeping an eye on him. They sent spies. This is, again, I'm quoting the text. Luke tells us, quote, they sent spies who pretended to be honest. They hoped to catch Jesus in something he said. Follow each word very closely.
Who sent the spies?
The chief priests, the one who were trying to find reasons.
Okay.
They sent spies to try to find reasons to arrest Jesus. To do so, just like an undercover cop, they sent undercover people to try to get him to say something incriminating that would give them evidence against him. They hoped, I'm quoting again from Luke, they hoped to catch Jesus in something he said so that they might hand him over to the power and authority of the governor. So the spies questioned him. Teacher, we know that you speak and teach what is right, and that you do not show partiality, but teach the way of God in accordance with the truth. Now they spring the question, is it right for us to pay taxes to Caesar or not? Now the us must mean that the spies are Jewish spies.
Well, that would make sense.
Right, because they're being sent. Okay. This is all happening. All the people involved in this particular aspect of the tale are Jews. Okay. Is it right? So it would seem, and they came on honest. It is an attempt at a trap. In trying to trap him, they sent spies to ask one specific question, and that question was, is it right for us to pay taxes? Now, what would in the world would send them to make them go through the trouble of sending underground investigators to find out about his attitude about taxation if he were not indeed, and this is a further part of the case of the importance of the taxation thing, if he were not strongly suspected of running afoul of tax law, of being somebody who was interfering with taxation. Why in the world are they going to such trouble? And again, it's Luke, among others, who's emphasized, but you find this story in the other synoptics as well. I think it's in Luke that you get the clearest picture of the taxation thing being central. But I think you get evidence of the same thing, maybe not as sharp and clear, in all of the Gospels.
Maybe Luke was more in tune with the politics of the organization.
He may have been, and how they operated, and how they were indeed attempting. In the first place, yes, I think you're right. In the first place, to get the Romans out, I think that would have been first on their agenda, like many of the Jews, so that it's quite possible that people who adhered to Jesus's movement were people who were sympathetic on that level. The most ethical, let us say, way of fighting Rome. Nonviolent resistance. Don't get out your spears. In fact, figure out other ways of making, as you said with the case of Gandhi, of making life miserable for the Romans without committing overt acts of violence at all. And in Jesus' case, yes, you were trying to overthrow things in that way. In Daniel, the book of Daniel that he quotes in the trial, it's clear that Daniel is his great ancestor on this point. He belongs to that branch of Jewish social philosophy that believes in driving out the existing powers and establishing a kingdom of God. Instead of the trash that we're getting now, a kingdom of real peace, of nonviolence, a nonviolent world. It can be done. And that's their Isaiah background, the whole great prophet Isaiah, who by the way, is behind everything, including all Christianity is haunted by the spirit of Isaiah. You know, the very words in Handel's Messiah, hallelujah, all of the words that are used in the Messiah by Handel are from the book of Isaiah. Isaiah is the prophet of liberation, salvation, and the kingdom of God. So they were all under the spell, and Jesus was simply the one who here's another thing, as I'm noticing more and more, is that in a way calling him God diminishes what I refuse to do that, because it diminishes what he was. He wasn't God. That's a silly thing to say. What he was a genius, which is a very different thing to say. a genius of this world, who was working in this world to change this world. Very, very different thing from by the time you get to the Gospel of John, fourth Gospel, Jesus' feet are hardly even touching the ground anymore. We have the etherealization of the Christ figure already becoming part of the Trinity, the Son aspect.
Yeah, you're absolutely right. But as a mystic, John could care less.
Right.
Yeah.
But that wasn't. But Jesus' solution was not a mystical solution. You're right about John, and let's give John all due credit. They asked the question, is it right for us to pay taxes to Caesar or not? Jesus saw through their duplicity and said to them, show me a denarius. That's a coin. So they show him a denarius. Whose portrait and inscription are on it? Caesar's, they replied. He said to them, quote, then give to Caesar what is Caesar's, and to God what is God's. End quote. Then Luke adds, they were unable to trap him in what he had said there in public. And astonished by his answer, they became silent. He befuddled them into silence. But look, does he ever say? It's conspicuous that he does not. Does he ever give them an answer to their question about taxation? Instead, having looked at a coin, this is magician kind of stuff. This is, watch my left hand while you do something with the right hand. He says, whose picture is that? Okay, then, he says, here's the conclusion I draw. Whatever properly belongs to Caesar, give that to Caesar, and whatever properly belongs to God, give that to God. Has he confessed to anything? Has he said that it's okay to pay taxes? He has not. He has said no such thing. He has brilliantly dodged the challenge, bewildering them. You know how the scene in the movie goes where somebody gets hoodwinked by Groucho Marx or somebody or Chico, who says something and talks him into believing something, walks out the door, and then suddenly stops. Like what? What was that? What did he say? What did he just say? He said, render unto Caesar that which is Caesar's, and unto God that which is God's. And you know what? Every one of us who's ever read that passage in church or whatnot has always noticed, at least subconsciously, that it's not an answer to the question. We've all felt, even if we didn't articulate to ourselves, this isn't an answer to the question.
Better than that, because you walk away going, what did he say?
Yeah, what did he say?
Yeah.
And finally, it's like what you end up with is, all he said is what properly belongs to God, properly belongs to God, and what properly belongs to Caesar, properly belongs to Caesar. I put it to you that if we take this passage together with a lot of these other brilliant Jesus passages where he does manage, well, okay, here's one more. John the Baptist sends people over to him to find out if he is the one they have been expecting. He does not answer John either. He points out that the blind are seeing now. He says, tell John the following. Facts. The blind see, the deaf hear, and the paralytics are walking around. But he never says an answer to the question of his status. The question was, what are you? Are you that? Are you the Messiah, whatever, that we have been expecting? Jesus actually answered. His answer is probably the answer he wanted to give. And he adds, by the way, and then I hope I'm not a stumbling block to anybody. It's almost like saying, as for me, I just hope I don't get in the way of things. That's actually the answer he gives.
It's actually almost Dalai Lama-ish like.
Yes. Oh yeah.
The other one that's priceless that everyone misses. The Pharisees come and ask him, what's the greatest commandment? And he answers what the Pharisees know. They know he knows that And he answers exactly what they expected he'd answer. But then they say, well, who's my neighbor? So instead of answering them, he tells the parable of the Good Samaritan and makes the most disgusting and ostracized individual in Jerusalem, the Samaritans, into the hero, while he disses a priest and a Levite. And then says, who was the neighbor? And the Pharisees go, well, the Samaritan. Well, there you go. You said it, I didn't. Really masterful.
That does, even the Samaritans. It does bring up some interesting stuff, though. If we study this further, we're going to have to devote a little time to the question of Jesus's focus, because he actually gives strong evidence of a very narrow focus on the Jewish community as still being where the action is, where don't go out among the Gentiles. And it gets even more disturbing. There are a few passages where he almost disturbingly shows a certain degree of prejudice against the Gentiles. The woman, in one, he relents in her case, but it's that passage about scraps from the table. Even a dog gets a. He says to her something nasty like, "I'm not going to deal with you. You know, she's not Jewish." And she comes back at him with, even dogs get scraps from the table. And at that point, he changes. But I don't want to hang anything heavy on him here, because I'm perfectly happy to have a Jesus who's all too human. But I do think it's very important that at that moment he does relent. But it also shows that his first preference in terms of his movement was clearly within the Jewish.
Well, it would make sense in and of the fact only that if you're fighting the good fight for your people, the Gentiles are kind of a distraction. The Gentiles aren't Rome. Jesus's bone to pick is with Rome, not necessarily with the Gentiles that are living around him. So it's not surprising that he's focused on what he's trying to do within his community for his people.
In political terms, Jesus did believe that the Jews were, because of their peculiar spiritual position, the vanguard movement. We would later call things, a vanguard movement stands for the fact that a certain narrower group is in fact the one that's the action center, but it is nonetheless in the name of a total world revolution. It's not a narrow revolution, but there is a vanguard to it. And I think that Jesus, along with Isaiah, it is fair to say that Isaiah was a traditional Jew in this respect, and it does go to the issue of what chosen people means, a people that felt that they were the vanguard, and we're under an obligation to be the vanguard of a certain kind of world movement of liberation. But Jesus is traditional in that sense.